You would open your Bibles to the book of Exodus, chapter 24. That will be the text for this evening. Exodus chapter 24. The Old Testament is a rather difficult landscape to sometimes get our heads around, and I find it helpful to remember the overall plan of God's story in redeeming humanity into a right relationship with Himself. If there are 5 key passages that are necessary for understanding the Old Testament, probably more than any others, I would say they are probably Genesis 3, which describes the curse of sin, the fall of man, and the introduction of a problem into this world of sin, as well as describing the solution to that problem, which is the promise that the seed of woman would ultimately crush the head of the serpent. Secondly, there's Genesis 12, a promise that was made to Abraham, that through Abraham's descendants all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Thirdly, there is the passage we are concerned with tonight, Exodus 24, dealing with the ratification of the Sinai Covenant. Fourthly, there is 2 Samuel 7 and the promise made to David to seat one of his descendants on the throne. And fifthly, there is Jeremiah 31, the promise to give a new covenant to the house of Israel and to the house of Judah, one that will be of a different character than the one that God made with their forefathers. I primarily want to look at Exodus 24 tonight because I think it's helpful to look at this and see where we have come from. What is our spiritual heritage? But first, some context. The book of Exodus, at the beginning of the book of Exodus, Israel is in the land of Egypt. They are enslaved to the Egyptians. The Pharaoh has been oppressing them, and they cry out to the Lord for deliverance. And the Lord raises up a deliverer in Moses. Moses is the one who is chosen to bring Israel out of the land of Egypt. He goes to Pharaoh and he insists Pharaoh let the people go. And Pharaoh refuses. He says no. So the Lord basically sends a series of plagues. Pharaoh asks the question, who is the Lord? In Exodus chapter 5 and verse 2, and the Lord gives him a 10-step correspondence course on the subject, more or less. A series of plagues that culminates with the death of all of the firstborn in Egypt. And Pharaoh is finally convinced at that point to release the people. Eventually Pharaoh releases them and they leave Egypt. But Pharaoh is still unwilling to let them go. Even after all this time, his heart is hardened. And so he pursues Israel out of the land of Egypt. And they've come to the Red Sea, and they're trapped between the armies of Pharaoh and the sea behind them. And Moses stretches out his rod, and the Lord parts the waters of the Red Sea so that the nation of Israel can cross through on dry ground. And as they're crossing through, Pharaoh's charioteers get the idea, we need to pursue them. Well, we're going to do that too. And they go through the Red Sea, and after Israel has crossed and Pharaoh's chariots and horsemen are still in the midst of the waters, Moses raises his staff again and the waters come crashing down on top of them, and the Egyptians are destroyed from pursuing Israel. And eventually Israel goes through the wilderness, and after much whining and complaining and fighting every step of the way, we want food, we want water, we want this, we want that. They finally come to Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19. And at Mount Sinai, the Lord appears on the mountain. And the form of the Lord is so terrifying. There is a thunder, there is an earthquake, there is the sound of a trumpet, there is lightning, there is a consuming fire on the mountaintop. And everyone is rightly terrified at the sight of the Lord on Mount Sinai. And in Exodus chapter 20, the Lord speaks the 10 commandments audibly to the people. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourselves a graven image, etc., etc. And the people's response to the 10 commandments in verse 18 of chapter 20, they perceived the thunder and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And the people saw it and they trembled and stood at a distance. And they said to Moses, speak to us yourself and we will listen, but let not God speak to us or we will die. There's something scary about the Lord being the one to talk to you. No. God spoke to me. Well, if God really spoke to you, would this be your reaction? I wonder. It's a very terrifying scene. And so Moses says, okay, and he goes up on the mountain and he receives the law from God to present to the people. And Exodus 21 and 22 and 23 are sometimes referred to as the Book of the Covenant. It's a section of the law. It's basically a series of stipulations that Israel must follow if they want to have a covenant relationship with God. It's a codification of the laws for their conduct. And in Exodus chapter 24, the text with which we are concerned tonight, this covenant is ratified. After Exodus 24, the rest of the book is concerned primarily with the tabernacle. Exodus 25 through 31 is all about the plan that God gives Moses for the tabernacle. And Exodus 35 through 40 is all about the actual construction of that tabernacle. And they're very similar sections to each other. The whole book, we might say, is about the tabernacle, with the exception of one little hiccup that starts in Exodus 32, when Israel gets the brilliant idea of building a golden calf in Moses' absence. But Exodus 24 is so important for understanding the relationship between God and Israel. I would like to begin reading in verse 1. That he said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and you shall worship at a distance. Moses alone, however, shall come near to the Lord, but they shall not come near, nor shall the people come up with him." Then Moses came and recounted to the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances, and all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words which the Lord has spoken to us, we will do." Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. Then he arose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. He sent young men of the sons of Israel, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as peace offerings to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and the other half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. And then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." So Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, "Behold the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." Now, I want to note a couple of things about this text. First of all, the layout of Mount Sinai is very similar to the layout of the tabernacle. The tabernacle had three major sections. There was the outer court, where all of the people could come to worship. There was the holy place, and only certain people could enter the holy place. The priests could enter to offer incense on the altar, to light the lamps, and to arrange the bread on the table. And then there was the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant sat. And it was a place that only one man could enter into, and only at God's express invitation. Only one day of the year was the high priest permitted in the most holy place. But what we need to realize is that Mount Sinai actually reflects this same threefold structure. All of the people are gathered together at the base of the mountain, which is a type of the outer court. But some of the people are invited to come up a certain distance. Aaron, Moses, Nadab and Abihu, who were priests. Although God has not explicitly said who the priests were. It's interesting, even though he tells Israel in Exodus 19 that you are to be a kingdom of priests, he still has a specific priesthood singles out here. And then, of course, some of the elders, they're permitted to come up part way up the mountain to eat a meal in the presence of God. But to the top of the mountain, only one man is permitted to go, Moses. And it is only at God's express invitation, once again, a type of the most holy place. I think this is important to realize. The tabernacle, the main function of the tabernacle was God's dwelling place. Earlier, Moses had been warned in Exodus 3 and verse 5, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." Wherever the presence of the Lord is, that place is holy. And the priests who served in the tabernacle, I think we need to remember that they too served barefoot in Exodus 28 and in Exodus 39. Shoes were not a part of the priestly attire of the Old Testament. As Job put it in a quote that is admittedly out of context, he makes the priests walk barefoot and overthrows the secure ones in Job chapter 12 and verse 19. When you come into God's house, you take your shoes off at the door. But all this is to say, Mount Sinai is a holy place. Not just anybody can go up on this mountain, but the Lord has invited certain people up onto this mountain for this covenant meal. Furthermore, we see that Sinai becomes a type of the tabernacle. God is planning to dwell with His people. God is planning to reside in a tent that's in the midst of the camp of Israel. And the people on this occasion swear obedience to the Lord. Moses tells the people everything that God has said in the book of the covenant, Exodus 21, 22, 23. And the people promise, we will be obedient. And then he reads it in book form in verse 7. And again, the people promise, we will do everything that the Lord has said. We will be obedient. This is actually the third time they have said this. They agreed to this earlier in chapter 19 in verse 8. In chapter 19 and verse 8, Moses calls the people. He informs them in brief form of what the covenant of the Lord will be, how they must keep God's commandments. And the people respond in verse 8, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. 3 times the people promise, we will be obedient to the words of the Lord. We will do everything that the Lord has told us to do. God had promised them that if they were obedient, He would make them a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. He would fulfill the promise of Abraham through them, to make all the nations blessed through them. Now, in Exodus 19, they haven't heard the whole covenant yet. So maybe they don't know fully what they're agreeing to. But here in Exodus 24, after they've heard everything that God has to say, they still say, we will be obedient. They're under no delusions about what they're committing to. We will obey the words of the Lord. And how long does that commitment last? 40 days. Not even 40 days before they build a golden calf, before they set up a graven image, the thing which the Lord explicitly commanded them not to do. We've got to be careful about making commitments. When we make a commitment to the Lord like this one, how easy it is to fall aside and fall astray and forget, what the Lord has told us to do. Forget to be obedient to His will. That's not what we're supposed to be. When we make a commitment to the Lord to follow Him and to do His will, that needs to be something that is continual. It's not a once-in-a-lifetime event. There's also a sacrifice that takes place here and a blood-sprinkling ceremony. Whenever 2 people make a covenant in the Bible, it's customary to offer a sacrifice in accompaniment with that and to eat a special meal to ratify this covenant. There's an example of 2 humans doing this in Genesis chapter 31. Jacob and Laban make a covenant with each other. Basically, their covenant is, we promise not to kill each other. We will not pass by this rock to each other for harm. But one of the things that they do in connection with this covenant, in verse 54 of Genesis 31, it says that Jacob offered a sacrifice on the mountain and called his kinsmen to the meal, and they ate the meal and spent the night on the mountain. So there's a sacrifice and a covenant meal used to ratify the covenant between Jacob and Laban in Genesis 31 and verse 54. Now Moses does something similar. He builds an altar. They didn't have a bronze altar of burnt offering yet. So he builds an altar out of 12 pillars or 12 stones. Exodus 20 actually gave instructions for how to build an altar. You couldn't use cut stones because you had made it common if you wielded your tool on it. And they sacrificed burnt offerings and peace offerings. And from these offerings, Moses takes the blood, and half of the blood is sprinkled on the altar to sanctify that altar. And the other half of the blood is sprinkled on the people in verse 8. Well, what is the significance of that? Well, the good news is that the New Testament actually tells us the significance of this in Hebrews chapter 9. Hebrews chapter 9 talks about what Moses was doing here. And the Hebrews 9, the greater context of the Hebrew author's argument is talking about this contrast between the new covenant of Jeremiah 31 and this old covenant that God had ratified at Mount Sinai. And so he draws on this text from Exodus 24 to make some of his points. In verse 18 of Hebrews chapter 9, it says that even the first covenant was not inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment had been spoken by Moses to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and the goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you." Now the Hebrew author gives us some extra details there. He doesn't talk, Exodus didn't mention explicitly the hyssop and the scarlet wool on that particular occasion, and I don't think it really mentioned sprinkling the book either. The Hebrew author mentions both of these things. And in verse 21, in the same way, he also sprinkled the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry with blood. That doesn't happen until Leviticus chapter 8, verse 15. And in verse 22, according to the law, one may almost say all things are cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness. The ratification of the covenant required death. Where a covenant is, verse 16, there is of necessity the death of the one who made it. And the shedding of blood must take place. Moses sprinkled blood on the people. He said, this is the blood of the covenant. He sprinkles the tabernacle and the vessels to again purify them. But why do the tabernacle and the vessels need purification? Well, because they are made out of things from this world, are they not? They were made with human hands. And they are corruptible. They needed to be made holy. They needed to be sanctified. But here's the kicker. Verse 23 says that it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be cleansed with these. In other words, it's necessary for the tabernacle to be cleansed with the blood. But the heavenly things themselves were better sacrifices than these. There's a hint there that Jesus' blood was actually used to cleanse things in heaven even. What was that? I can only speculate. I don't know for certain. But it is clear that even heaven itself might have been defiled or contaminated in some way, and it needed to be sanctified. Verse 24, he writes that Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands, a mere copy of the true one, but into heaven itself now to appear in the presence of God for us. Nor was it that he would offer himself often as the high priest enters the holy place year by year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise, he would have needed to suffer often since the foundation of the world. But now once, at the consummation of the ages, he has been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And inasmuch as it is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes judgment, so Christ also, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time for salvation without reference to sin to those who eagerly await him. This text really deserves its own sermon. I'm not going to pretend to cover all of it here in this evening's session, but Hebrews chapter 9 it describes the cleansing that took place at the sprinkling of the blood of the old covenant. So let me ask you something. Was the new covenant, was there blood of the new covenant that cleanses us? Well, yes, there is. The purpose of the sprinkled blood was to cleanse the people from their sin, from their defilements. Sin has a contaminating influence. It's like a toxic sludge that pollutes everything around it. This blood acts as a decontaminant. It makes the people holy. This is very much in line with the purpose of what is traditionally called the sin offering, or more appropriately, the purification offering. Jesus says something similar when he gives the ordinance of the Lord's Supper in Matthew chapter 26. In Matthew chapter 26 and verses 27 and 28. Well, first he gives them the bread and says, "Take, eat, this is my body." But then he said afterwards, when he had taken a cup and given thanks, he gave it to them saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for forgiveness of sins." Jesus is going back to that language of Exodus 24 and saying, this is the blood of the covenant. Moses gave you blood of the covenant when he made that covenant. But I have a new covenant for you, one that brings about the forgiveness of sins. That is a covenant that we participate in every time we eat the Lord's Supper. He sprinkles the tabernacle and the vessels on this occasion. Well, no, I'm misplacing my eyes on my notes. The covenant meal also foreshadows this idea. God calls all of the elders, he calls Moses and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu, he calls them all up on the mountain to eat a meal in his presence. It's not just sacrifice that ratifies the covenant, but also a meal. And that is a meal, there's a sense in which the Lord's Supper is our covenant meal with God. And every time we eat it, we are sort of re-ratifying the covenant. It denotes acceptance and fellowship. It denotes a respect and a cooperation that takes place. When we eat the meal with God, with Christ in our presence, who eats with us in the kingdom even now, it shows that God has accepted us. And it shows that we have accepted God. But of course we must do so in a worthy manner. If our lives are not consistent with the terms of the covenant, then the covenant meal is for naught. Did Israel's covenant meal save them when they built a golden calf 40 days later? No. Will our covenant meal save us if we set up idols in our hearts? No, it won't. Go back to Exodus 24. We got to continue reading here. In verses 9 through 11, we have lunch with Yahweh. Moses went up with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel. And under his feet there appeared to be a pavement of sapphire, as clear as the sky itself. And yet he did not stretch out his hand against the nobles of the sons of Israel, and they saw God. They ate and drank. Once again, this meal shows God's acceptance of the people. He did not stretch out his hand against them in verse 11. They saw the God of Israel. He kind of repeats that a couple times here. Verse 10, they saw the God of Israel. Verse 11, they saw God. In spite of the fact that later on in Exodus 33 and verse 20, God explicitly says that no one can see my face and live. In spite of the fact that the Apostle John later writes, no one has seen God at any time in John 1:14 and in 1 John 4 and verse 12. Now, inevitably, when people make those statements in the Bible, no one has seen God at any time. Or when God was talking to Moses, no one can see my face and live. You expect somebody to chime in, well, wait a second, God, what about this incident over here in Exodus 24? Didn't people see you then? Okay. What do we do with that? Is that a biblical contradiction? Well, no. It's not like Exodus was written by somebody who forgot what he wrote several chapters ago. And it's not like John was completely ignorant of what it said in the book of Exodus, since he alludes to it pretty pervasively throughout John chapter 1. He wants us to see that because he wants us to draw this connection. When God says, you cannot see my face, for no man can see me and live, we're supposed to remember this passage in verse 10 of Exodus 24. Because it suggests that the elders saw something, but they didn't see God's face. Moses gets to see God's back later, whatever that looks like. In chapter 33 and verse 23, God says, I'll let you see my back, but you can't see my face. And all indications from this text are that this is a unique experience that no one in Israel ever had. John's passages about no one seeing God are direct allusions to the Exodus experience. We're supposed to, hey, wait a second, what about Moses here? Seeing God in the Bible, anytime somebody sees God in the Bible, look closely at those passages. It's never a describable experience. Now what Moses saw was glorious, but he did not see the Lord's face. It's not the greatest thing that God has to offer. What the elders of Israel saw was glorious, but that is not the most glorious thing that God has to offer. In fact, I would say this, that the closest anyone has ever come to seeing God was not here on Mount Sinai, and it was not Moses later on Mount Sinai. It was when the person and character of Jesus Christ. It was when Jesus, the Word, became flesh and dwelt among us and died on a cross for our sins. That is a fuller demonstration of God's glory than anything, because it demonstrates His love and His compassion for us. How even though this awesome God who appeared in great fire and smoke and lightning and terror on Mount Sinai is the same God who is willing to put Himself to death for the sake of humanity because He loves us. And what the elders saw on the mountaintop, we don't get a real description of that, do we? In fact, there's another text I want to look at, Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 15 through 20. In Deuteronomy 4, in verse 15, it says that watch yourselves carefully, since you did not see any form on the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb from the midst of the fire. Moses reminds the people here, you don't actually know what God looks like. You didn't see a form. Therefore, verse 16, you should not act corruptly and make a graven image for yourselves in the form of any figure. The likeness of male or female, the likeness of any animal that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged bird that flies in the sky, the likeness of anything that creeps on the ground, the likeness of any fish that is in the water below the earth. And beware not to lift up your eyes to heaven and see the sun and the moon and the stars, all the host of heaven, and be drawn away and worship them and serve them, those which the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. But the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace from Egypt to be a people from His own possession as today. There's a reason we don't know what God looks like. Because if we knew what God looks like, you know what the first thing people would do would be? They'd try to build a statue of it. That's how humanity operates. That's always been how humanity has operated. And here's the real kicker. The first attempt they try to make of visually representing Yahweh, A golden calf. They couldn't come up with anything else? That's the best thing they could come up with? Really? Oh, and might I add, the guy who formed and fashioned this golden calf was Aaron, one of the guys who supposedly saw God on the mountaintop. Now either God looks like a calf or Aaron's just given his best guess and it's not very good. Aaron saw the God of Israel. Could he come up with a better representation? Or is it simply that God is too glorious, too unapproachable for us to really describe Him? In 1 Timothy 6 and verse 16 it says that He alone possesses immortality and dwells in unapproachable light, whom no man has seen or can see. To Him be honor and eternal dominion. Amen. And you know what? We are told about what God looks like. The first thing that we'd be wondering, they saw the God of Israel. Oh, cool, what did He look like? Well, under His feet was a pavement of sapphire. Oh. What? What's significant about that? Well, the significance is how insignificant it is, how utterly unimportant that detail is. If I ask you to describe someone, you don't start telling me about the floor under their feet. That's not how it works. Nobody ever begins a set of descriptions that way, but that's how they describe God. Because that's as close as man gets. That's as much as man gets to see. The floor under his feet. And even that is too glorious to really give in great detail. You see these types of passages all over the Old Testament. In Isaiah 6, Isaiah saw the Lord in His temple, and all he talks about is the train of His robe and the smoke and the little the seraphim with the wings. It doesn't tell you anything about what God looked like. Ezekiel does this almost to the point of excess in Ezekiel chapter 1. Ezekiel spends all this time talking about these winged beings and these wheels. And you read Ezekiel 1 sometimes and just look at, he devotes so much space to describing these wheels. A passage that is some of the most frustrating Hebrew in the Old Testament to translate. And at the end of it, I'm going, well, okay, that's great. We know all about whirling wheels. What's God look like? Well, in verse 26 of Ezekiel 1, it says, "Now, above the expanse that was over their heads, there was something resembling a throne, like lapis lazuli in appearance. And on that which resembled a throne, high up, was a figure with the appearance of a man." It sort of kind of looked like maybe something. You see how he doesn't want to tell you what it looks like because he can't. I don't know. Maybe it kind of sort of looked like this. And Ezekiel's language gets more, the closer you get to God, the more vague the language gets. And then he says, that was what the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord was like. Not the Lord, not the glory of the Lord, not the likeness of the glory of the Lord, but the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord looked like that. Ezekiel 10:1 has the same thing. "I looked, and behold, in the expanse that was over the heads of the cherubim, something like a sapphire stone, its appearance resembling a throne above them." The sapphire looks kind of like a throne. And the consistent pattern through Scripture is that any time someone is actually said to see God, what they describe is something so utterly insignificant, and yet at the same time something that's actually very beautiful and glorious, that the reader is left asking this question, but what does God look like? And the answer is that they didn't really see God. They just saw His dining room floor. They just saw the train of His robe. They just saw what they think might be the chair He sits in. And that alone was enough to make them fall on their face. These things are so glorious by themselves, it is as they've seen God. What must God Himself be like? What must the guy who owns this dining room be like? What must the guy with the robe that this train is part of be like? And when we read the Scriptures, what do we see? Well, we see the character of Jesus. Jesus is someone who gives us the fullest glimpse we get, and yet it is still but a glimpse, a tiny glimpse, at the infinite majesty and glory of God. And when we read that, when we see God's glory and majesty, when we get the opportunity to proverbially gaze at His dining room floor, that ought to change us. That ought to transform us. God has something much better in store than what I'm currently living in. Finally, coming back to the text again, verses 12 through 18 of Exodus 24. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and remain there, and I will give you the stone tablets with the law and the commandments which I have written for their instruction." So Moses arose with Joshua his servant, and Moses went up to the mountain of God. But to the elders he said, "Wait here for us until we return to you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a legal matter, let him approach them." Moses went up to the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord rested on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. And on the 7th day he called to Moses from the midst of the cloud, and to the eyes of the sons of Israel, the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a consuming fire on the mountaintop. Moses entered the midst of the cloud as he went on to the mountain. Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. The reason Moses is called up there, that's given, is that he's going to receive the 2 tablets of the covenant. I think I may have mentioned this before. When God gave Moses the 2 stone tablets of the covenant, some of the drawings we get, the artwork we get, some kind of portrays it like, half the commandments were on one tablet, half the commandments were on the other. Really, if we're following if ancient Near Eastern covenant practices mean anything, what's really probably going on is God gives Moses 2 copies of the same tablet. The idea is when 2 parties made a covenant, they would make a copy of the agreement, one for each of them, and they would take it back to their homeland. Both copies will be kept in the camp of Israel because the Lord is planning to dwell with Israel. And part of the reason Moses is called up is to explain this idea. That God's going to build a tabernacle, He's going to build an ark to hold the tablets, and He's going to build all these different things in order to have God dwell among Israel and be their God in a more intimate sense. But we see that Moses goes up on the mountain. He leaves Aaron and Hur and the elders in charge, and the rest, as they say, is history. It's an ominous foreshadowing of what will happen in his absence. God's glory rests on the mountain. And then Moses goes up to see God's glory. What do we learn from that scene? We know that Moses didn't eat or drink on that mountain for 40 days and 40 nights because Deuteronomy tells us that he fasted that whole time. But it also tells us something else. Even though the elders saw the God of Israel, they couldn't go up all the way. God had something better to offer. He had an even closer relationship with Him to offer. I think that the practical lesson for us is this. We should never be satisfied with how much we presently know God. We should never be satisfied with our present state of spiritual well-being. No matter how old or young you are, you should never be satisfied with your relationship with God. Paul spoke to the Corinthians. Corinthians had the gifts of prophecy and knowledge. That sounds pretty cool. I'd like some of that. And you know what Paul says? You're just looking in a mirror dimly. There's something better coming. You can see face to face. In the same way, I would say this, that the Scriptures are, in a sense, just another mirror. Just another thing that we hold up to ourselves. One that exposes our faults for what they are. One that discloses God to us. But at the end of the day, there's a big difference between looking at a photo of somebody and seeing them face to face. Scripture is not God's last word, but a lamp. As 2 Peter 1:19 puts it, it is a lamp in a dark place, guiding us until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts, until Jesus returns. We don't just go halfway up the mountain. We are being invited into the Holy of Holies itself, to see God face to face as He truly is. What a glorious hope that He gives us. In 1 John chapter 3, in verses 1 through 3, it says, "To see how great a love the Father has bestowed on us, that we would be called children of God. And such we are. For this reason the world does not know us, because it did not know Him. Beloved, now we are children of God, and it has not appeared as yet what we will be. We know that when He appears we will be like Him, because we will see Him just as He is. And everyone who has this hope fixed on Him purifies himself just as He is pure." God has something greater to offer. And if we fix our hope on Him, we will purify ourselves. What a glorious hope that is. But from the outside looking in, I would submit that there's also a warning. And this is something else we need to keep in mind as well. That to everyone who's at the bottom of the mountain, The appearance of God is like a consuming fire on the mountaintop. Deuteronomy 4:24 warned the same thing. The Lord was like a consuming fire on the mountaintop. God is not one to be trifled with. He's powerful. He's not this big teddy bear. He's not like Santa Claus. And He can destroy Israel as quickly as He destroyed the pagan Egyptians in the Red Sea if they take Him for granted. So what has changed? Well, let's look at the New Testament says about this. In Hebrews chapter 12, beginning in verse 18, the writer says this: "You have not come to a mountain that can be touched, and to a blazing fire, and to darkness, and to gloom, and to whirlwind, and to the blast of a trumpet, and the sound of words, which sound was such that those who heard begged that no further word be spoken to them." Pretty obvious, he's describing Mount Sinai here. In verse 20 it says, "They could not even bear the command, if even a beast touches the mountain, it will be stoned. And so terrible was the sight that Moses himself said, 'I am full of fear and trembling.'" Moses is scared of this thing too. You think Moses was going up to the top of the mountain without any apprehension? He said, "I am full of fear and trembling," in Deuteronomy 9:19. Is that the mountain we've come to? A mountain of fear? Is that the covenant that we have been ratified with? Well, no, things are a little different now. In verse 22 he says, "You have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, to the heavenly Jerusalem, to the myriads of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn ones who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood which speaks better than the blood of Abel." We've come to Mount Zion. We've come to the great city of the living God. We've come into His presence. We are part of a new congregation, a congregation that stretches back even to Abel. What kind of glorious congregation is that part of? Does God not have something better in mind? Oh, yes, He does. So let me ask you a question. Does the fact that we're coming to Mount Zion instead of Mount Sinai mean that God's character has changed? Does it mean that God no longer is fearsome or not to be trifled with? Does it mean that we can just live however we want? Keep reading. See to it in verse 25 that you do not refuse Him who is speaking. For if those did not escape when they refused Him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape, who turn away from Him who warns from heaven. Is obedience more important now or less important? It's more important now, obviously. Verse 26, His voice shook the earth then, but now He has promised, saying, "Yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heaven." It's not just the ground that's going to quake this time. The entirety of creation will be shaken. This expression, verse 27, "yet once more," denotes the removing of those things which can be shaken as of created things, so that those things which cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we receive a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us show gratitude by which we may offer to God an acceptable servants with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. He is a consuming fire, and our obedience to Him is more important now than it has ever been. And while we are not under the Sinai Covenant anymore, Hebrews chapter 8 talked about this at length, quoting Jeremiah 31, that the Lord makes a new covenant, not like the one made with the fathers, not the one which they broke. It's a covenant that involves the forgiveness of sins. A remembrance of sins will no longer be there. That covenant is not like the old one at all. And the mountain that the covenant is made at is not like the old one. We are not here we are invited to the top of the mountain once again for a great feast and for an eternal covenant and for the very forgiveness of our sins itself. It is no longer Mount Sinai where only one man can go to the top. It is Mount Zion where all of us can go to the top and we can see God face to face in a way that the elders never did and that Moses never did and that no one in history has ever done. That's the invitation. Will we accept? take out your songbooks. I did not plan this, but Keith pretty much picked the best invitation song you could for this sermon. Because that's what this is really about. Zion has issued an invitation, a proclamation. And it is not just, the invitation to get baptized. I'm looking around here. It seems like, everyone that can or should be baptized at this point has done so. It's talking about something else altogether. This invitation to live with God. And if we are not living like we're living with God right now, we need to change. If we have given up on trying to improve ourselves, if we are not pressing forward to the future, if we are still clinging to things in the past that we think were so wonderful when they weren't, just admit we're missing the point altogether. Let us not be like Israel, who longed for the idols of Egypt, who longed for the ways of the past, who got impatient when Moses didn't come down and built a golden calf for themselves. Instead, let us show faithfulness. Let us put aside the idols of our heart. Let us stay steadfastly devoted to the Lord. And let us make their promise into our reality, that all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. If we are faithful to Him, He has a crown of life waiting for us. And I know I would like to have that as much as anyone here would. If there's anything we can do to make your life right with the Lord this evening, now will be an appropriate time to let that be known. While together we stand and we sing.